Hello everyone, welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight we bring you some of the most unsettling accounts ever reported from deep inside Appalachian state parks, where the mountains hold onto their secrets and the trails don't always lead where the maps say they should. Blacktop Files collects long-form true horror from across the United States, stories that never made the evening news, but left marks on the people who lived through them. This episode focuses on a specific kind of place, the state parks that sprawl across the Appalachian Range, those vast protected areas where maintained trails give way to old-growth forest, where cell service cuts out miles before you reach the trailhead, and where rangers will tell you with absolute sincerity not to hike alone after 4 in the afternoon. These aren't the busy tourist parks with visitor centers and paved loops. These are the older reserves, the ones absorbed from national forest land or decommissioned logging territory, places where the infrastructure is minimal, and the distances between facilities can span 10 or 15 miles of ridge and hollow. The accounts you're about to hear come from park employees, seasonal workers, maintenance crews, and a few visitors who had the misfortune of staying just a little too long past closing time. What makes these stories particularly disturbing is how consistent they are. Different people, different years, different sections of the same parks, but the details align in ways that make you wonder what's actually out there in those woods. The Appalachians are old mountains, worn down over millions of years, and the forests that cover them are dense, tangled, and darker than you'd expect even on a clear day. When something goes wrong out there, help is far away. When something impossible happens, there's no one close enough to verify it or tell you that you're mistaken. If these accounts unsettle you the way they unsettled us, consider subscribing to Blacktop Files and turning on notifications so you'll know when the next episode drops. And if you've worked in a state park, a national forest, or any of the old recreational areas scattered through rural America, we'd like to hear from you. Share your encounters in the comments. A future file might be built around what you experienced. Let's begin with the first account, from a man who took a job he thought would be simple, maintaining trails during the off-season when almost no one visits. I took the job because I needed the money and didn't mind being alone. Trail maintenance in late fall and winter doesn't pay much, but it's steady work, and the Park Service offered housing in one of the old ranger cabins about 3 miles in from the main gate. The park itself covers something like 40,000 acres, most of it unbroken forest climbing up and down ridges that all look the same after a while. My job was to walk assigned sections of trail, clear fallen branches, check for erosion, mark hazards, and file reports, every evening over the radio since there was no cell service anywhere in the park. The cabin had a wood stove, a cot, a desk, and a 2-way radio mounted on the wall. No running water, but there was a hand pump outside and an outhouse about 30 yards into the trees. The park had officially closed for the season in mid-October, which meant the gates were locked and no day visitors were allowed in. I was one of 2 people staying on the property. The other was the park supervisor, who lived in the main office near the entrance, about 8 miles away by Service Road. I only saw him twice in the first month. He'd drive up in his truck, drop off supplies, ask if I'd seen anything unusual, and leave before it got dark. I asked him once what he meant by unusual, and he just said to report anyone I saw on the trail since the park was closed, and technically anyone back there was trespassing. He also told me to keep the cabin locked at night and not to follow any lights I saw moving through the trees. I thought he was joking. He wasn't smiling. The trails I was assigned covered a section of the park that used to be more popular, back when the state maintained a campground and a picnic area near a creek that runs along the base of a ridge. The campground had been closed for years, though the picnic tables were still there, rotting under the trees. The trails looped through that area and then climbed up into the ridges, passing through dense laurel thickets and stands of old hemlock. It was beautiful in a bleak sort of way, especially once the leaves were down and you could see farther into the woods. But it was also unnervingly quiet. No birds after a certain point in the day, no squirrels, just wind and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. I'd been there about 5 weeks when I started noticing footprints on the trails. Not boot prints from hikers, which would have been strange enough given that the park was closed. These were bare footprints. Human feet, adult-sized, no shoes. The first time I saw them, I assumed someone had walked through recently, maybe a trespasser or someone from one of the communities farther up the mountain who used the park as a shortcut. But the prints were too clear, too deep, pressed into the cold mud as if whoever made them had been walking slowly and deliberately. It had rained the night before, and the trail surface was soft, so the prints stood out sharply, each toe defined, the arch visible, the heel dug in slightly deeper than the ball of the foot. I radioed the supervisor that evening and told him what I'd found. He asked where exactly, and I described the section of trail, a narrow path that runs parallel to the creek for about a mile before turning uphill. He was quiet for a moment, then told me to mark the location on my map and avoid that trail for a few days. He said he'd come up and take a look, but he never did. When I asked him about it a week later, he said he'd checked and didn't see anything. I didn't argue, but I knew he was lying. I'd gone back to that section of trail myself after 3 days, and the footprints were still there, barely faded despite another night of rain. Worse, there were new ones farther along the path, heading in the same direction, toward the old campground. I kept working my assigned routes and tried not to think about it. November turned colder, and frost started to appear on the ground most mornings, making the trail slick and the woods even quieter. I saw the footprints again 2 weeks later, this time on a different trail, one that led up to a fire tower that hadn't been used in decades. The prints started at the base of the trail and continued upward, spaced evenly, as if someone had climbed the ridge in the middle of the night. I followed them for about half a mile, and then they stopped. Not at a road or a clearing, they just ended in the middle of the trail, as if whoever made them had simply stopped walking and vanished. I started to feel watched. It's hard to explain, but anyone who spent time alone in the woods knows the feeling. It's not paranoia. It's a physical sensation, a tightness in your chest, an awareness of space behind you. I'd be clearing a section of trail, and I'd hear something move in the laurel thickets, something too large to be a deer, but too quiet to be a person walking normally. I'd stop, listen, and hear nothing. Then, as soon as I started working again, the sound would return, always behind me, always just far enough away that I couldn't see what was making it. One evening in late November, I was finishing up a section of trail near the old campground when I noticed something on one of the picnic tables. It was a shirt, a plain gray t-shirt, folded neatly and placed in the center of the table. The shirt was dry, which was strange because it had rained that morning and everything else in the clearing was soaked. I walked over and picked it up. It was cold to the touch, far colder than the air around it, and it smelled like wet earth and something else, something faintly sweet and rotten. I dropped it back onto the table and stepped away. There was no one else in the park. The gates were locked. I was miles from the nearest road. I radioed the supervisor and told him what I'd found. He told me to leave it alone and get back to the cabin before dark. I didn't sleep well that night. The wind picked up after midnight, rattling the shutters and making the trees creak and groan. I kept the wood stove burning and sat at the desk with the radio on, listening to static. Around 2 a.m, I heard footsteps outside, not on the trail, closer. Right outside the cabin, slow and deliberate, circling from the front porch to the side wall to the back. I sat perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped at the back wall, directly behind where I was sitting. Then I heard something else, a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingernails on wood. It moved along the wall from the corner to the window and stopped. I turned my head slowly and looked at the window. The shutters were closed, but through the gap I could see a shape, a dark outline pressed against the glass, too tall to be crouching, too still to be swaying in the wind. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The shape stayed there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes. Then it pulled away, and the footsteps resumed, moving back toward the front of the cabin and then farther out, into the trees. I waited until dawn before I opened the door. When I finally stepped outside, I saw them immediately. Bare footprints in the frost, circling the cabin, stopping at the back window, then leading away into the woods. The prints were deeper than before, as if whoever made them had been carrying something heavy. I radioed the supervisor as soon as it was light enough to see clearly. I told him everything: the footprints, the shirt, the shape at the window. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd come up that afternoon and we'd talk. He arrived around 3, parked his truck near the cabin, and walked the perimeter with me, looking at the prints. He didn't say much, just nodded and took a few pictures with a camera he'd brought. When we went back inside, he told me that the park had a history. He didn't elaborate, but he said that people had reported similar things over the years, especially in the off-season when the park was closed. He said the state knew about it but didn't publicize it because it would scare people away. He also said that whatever it was, it didn't seem interested in harming anyone, just watching. I asked him what I was supposed to do if it came back. He said to keep the cabin locked and not to go outside after dark. It came back 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. Each time I heard the footsteps circling the cabin, stopping at the windows, tapping on the walls. Each time I stayed inside and waited for it to leave. The prints were always there in the morning, deeper and more deliberate, as if it was testing the boundaries, seeing how close it could get. I stopped sleeping. I kept the stove burning all night and the radio on, tuned to the emergency frequency, even though I knew no one would respond in time if something happened. I started counting the days until my contract ended in mid-December. The last time I saw the prints was 2 days before I left. I was walking the trail near the old fire tower, finishing my final inspection of that section, when I found them again. But this time, they weren't alone. There were other prints alongside them, smaller, child-sized, bare feet pressed into the mud in the same deliberate way. The 2 sets of prints walked side by side for about 100 yards, then stopped at the base of the tower. I looked up at the tower, a rusted metal structure that hadn't been climbed in years, and saw something hanging from the railing at the top. It was the gray shirt, tied to the rail and flapping in the wind. I didn't climb the tower. I turned around and walked back to the cabin as fast as I could without running. I left the park on December 15th and didn't say goodbye to the supervisor. I loaded my gear into my truck, drove out through the main gate, and didn't look back. I heard later that the park hired someone else for the winter maintenance position, but that person quit after 2 weeks. The supervisor told people it was because of the isolation, but I know better. I drove past the park once, about 5 years later, on my way to visit family farther south. The entrance gate was still there, locked and rusted, and the sign had been updated with new regulations and warnings about trail closures. I didn't stop. I've thought about those prints a lot over the years, about the shape at the window and the shirt on the tower. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to. But I know it's still out there, walking those trails in the off-season, circling the cabins, waiting for someone to follow it into the woods. The thing about state parks in the Appalachians is that they're built on land that wasn't always empty. Before the state bought the property and turned it into recreational areas, people lived there, worked there, died there. The parks absorbed old communities, logging camps, homesteads, and graveyards that didn't get marked on any map. You can still find the remnants if you know where to look. Stone foundations, rusted machinery, hand-dug wells. And sometimes, late at night when the park is closed and the gates are locked, you can still hear them walking. I worked as a park ranger for 6 years in a state park that covers about 30,000 acres of ridgeline and hollow in the southern Appalachians. The park is popular during the summer, with campgrounds, hiking trails, and a small lake that attracts families and school groups. But in the off-season, from late October through early April, the park is mostly empty. The campgrounds close, the lake access gets gated, and the only people on the property are the skeleton crew of rangers who handle maintenance, patrols, and emergency calls. I was part of that crew, and my shift was the night patrol, which meant driving the park roads from sunset to sunrise, checking gates, monitoring trailheads, and making sure no one was trespassing or camping illegally. The park has about 40 miles of paved and gravel roads that wind through the property, connecting the campgrounds, picnic areas, and trailheads. Most of the roads are narrow, single-lane paths that hug the sides of ridges or dip down into hollows where the trees grow so thick you can't see more than a few feet into the woods. During the day, the roads are scenic, the kind of place where people pull over to take pictures. At night, especially in the off-season, there's something else entirely. The headlights of your vehicle only reach so far, and beyond that, the darkness is total. No streetlights, no houses, no ambient light from nearby towns. Just trees and shadows and the occasional reflection of animal eyes caught in the beams. I'd been working the night shift for about 3 years when I started noticing the abandoned vehicles. It wasn't unusual to find cars parked along the roads during the day, left by hikers or campers who'd gotten an early start. But these vehicles were different. They appeared at night, always in the same locations, always empty, always with no signs of the driver. The first one I found was a sedan, an older model, parked on a gravel pullout near one of the trailheads. The doors were unlocked, the keys were in the ignition, and the interior was clean. No trash, no personal items, nothing to indicate who the car belonged to or why it had been left there. I ran the plates and found that the vehicle had been reported stolen 3 months earlier from a town about 60 miles away. I radioed dispatch and waited for instructions. They told me to document the scene and have the vehicle towed in the morning. I took photos, checked the surrounding area for footprints or signs of activity, and found nothing. The ground around the pullout was undisturbed and the trailhead gate was locked, which meant no one should have been able to access the trail. I finished my patrol and filed a report, assuming it was an isolated incident. But 2 weeks later, I found another vehicle, this time a pickup truck, parked on a different road about 5 miles from the first location. Same situation. Doors unlocked, keys in the ignition, no driver, no signs of struggle. The truck had been reported stolen from a neighboring state. Over the next 6 months, I found 4 more vehicles. All of them were parked in remote locations, always at night, always empty. Dispatch started tracking the reports and a pattern emerged. The vehicles were all stolen, all reported missing from towns within a 100-mile radius of the park, and all found in locations that were difficult to access and far from the main roads. The state police got involved and started running their own patrols through the park, but they never found anything. No suspects, no witnesses, no explanation for how the vehicles were getting into the park or why they were being abandoned in such specific locations. I started paying closer attention during my patrols, taking different routes, stopping at random intervals to listen and watch. The park at night is never completely silent. There's always wind, always the distant sound of water running through the hollows, always the occasional cry of an owl or the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. But some nights, the sounds changed. I'd be driving along one of the remote roads, windows down, listening to the forest, and I'd hear something that didn't fit. Footsteps on gravel, the creak of a door opening, the low murmur of voices. I'd stop the vehicle, kill the engine, and listen. The sounds would continue for a few seconds, then stop. abruptly, as if whoever or whatever was making them had realized I was there. One night in early March, I was patrolling a road that runs along the top of a ridge, a narrow gravel path with steep drop-offs on both sides. It was late, past 2 in the morning, and the fog had rolled in thick, cutting visibility to less than 20 feet. I was driving slowly, headlights barely penetrating the fog, when I saw something in the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, standing in the middle of the road facing away from me. I slowed to a stop and turned on the spotlight mounted on the roof of my vehicle. The figure didn't move. It was a man, average height, wearing dark clothes, his head slightly bowed as if he was looking at the ground. I called out through the PA system, identifying myself as a park ranger and asking him to step to the side of the road. He didn't respond. I opened the door and stepped out, keeping one hand on my radio. The fog was so thick I could barely see the figure now, just a vague silhouette about 15 feet ahead. I called out again, louder this time, and took a few steps forward. The figure turned its head slightly, not enough to see a face, just enough to acknowledge that it had heard me. Then it stepped off the road, into the fog, and disappeared. I ran forward, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there. No footprints in the soft earth, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been standing there at all. I radioed dispatch and reported the encounter, describing the figure and the location. The dispatcher asked if I wanted backup, and I said yes, even though I knew it would take at least 30 minutes for another ranger to reach me. I waited by the vehicle, lights on, scanning the tree line. The fog was so dense I couldn't see more than a few feet into the woods, but I had the overwhelming sense that I was being watched, not by one person, but by many. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and patient, waiting to see what I would do. The backup ranger arrived about 40 minutes later, and we searched the area together, walking the road and the surrounding woods with flashlights and radios. We found nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, no signs of recent activity. The other ranger asked if I was sure about what I'd seen, and I told him I was. He didn't press the issue, but I could tell he was skeptical. We finished the patrol together, and I went home at dawn, too tired to think clearly. The sightings continued. Over the next few months, I saw the figure 3 more times, always in the same area, always at night, always in heavy fog. Each time it would stand in the road, turn its head slightly when I called out, and then step into the trees and vanish. I stopped reporting it after the second time because I knew how it sounded. I started dreading that section of road, avoiding it when I could, taking alternate routes even if it meant adding an extra hour to my patrol. In late June, another vehicle was found, this time a van, parked on the same ridge road where I'd seen the figure. The van was empty, doors unlocked, keys in the ignition. Inside, rangers found a map of the park with several locations marked in red ink. The marks corresponded to the places where the other vehicles had been found. The van had been reported stolen 2 weeks earlier. The driver was never located. The state police increased their presence in the park, but the sightings stopped. No more vehicles were found. The figure I'd seen in the fog never appeared again. I worked one more season at that park before I transferred to a different location farther north. I didn't tell anyone the real reason I wanted to leave, but the other rangers knew. They'd all seen things, heard things, felt things they couldn't explain. The park supervisor once told me that the land doesn't forget. He said the people who lived there before the park existed never really left, that their routines and paths were still embedded in the landscape, repeating endlessly in the fog and the dark. I didn't believe him at the time, but I think about that conversation a lot now. I drove through that park a few years ago during the day, when the roads were full of families and the campgrounds were packed. It looked normal, beautiful even, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees and the trails wound through the ridges. But I knew what it looked like at night, when the fog rolled in and the roads were empty. I knew what was standing in the middle of those roads, waiting for someone to stop and call out. I didn't stay long. I took a few pictures, got back in my truck, and drove away. Some places don't want you to linger. I spent a summer working at a state park in the Central Appalachians, one of those places that's popular with families during the day but empties out fast once the sun starts dropping. The park had a large campground, several picnic areas, and a network of trails that ranged from easy loops to strenuous climbs. My job was to work the entrance station during peak hours, checking permits, handing out maps, and answering questions about trail conditions and wildlife. It was easy work mostly, and the pay was decent enough for a seasonal position. I stayed in a small trailer near the maintenance yard, about half a mile from the campground, sharing the space with another seasonal worker who handled trail maintenance. The park had been built on land that used to be a logging operation, and if you knew where to look, you could still find remnants of that history. Old railroad grades, rusted equipment, collapsed structures hidden under layers of kudzu and creeper vine. The trails followed some of the old logging roads, and a few of the picnic areas were built on sites that had once been lumber camps. The Park Service didn't advertise that history, probably because it wasn't the kind of thing that attracted visitors, but the older rangers would talk about it sometimes, especially the ones who'd worked there for decades. They'd mention finding things in the woods, old tools, bottles, bones. They'd talk about sections of trail that felt wrong, places where the temperature dropped suddenly, where the sounds of the forest stopped completely. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed it was just the usual folklore that gets attached to old places, the kind of stories people tell to make their jobs more interesting. But about 3 weeks into the season, something happened that made me start paying attention. I was closing the entrance station for the night, locking up the booth and getting ready to walk back to my trailer, when I saw a child standing near the edge of the parking lot. She was maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a dirty white dress, her hair tangled and hanging over her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the ground. I assumed she'd gotten separated from her family and called out, asking if she was okay. She didn't respond. I walked closer, and she turned her head slightly, just enough that I could see part of her face. Her eyes were dark, too dark, and her skin had a grayish tint that didn't look right in the fading light. I stopped walking and asked again if she needed help. She took a step backward, into the trees, and then another, moving slowly, deliberately, her eyes locked on mine. Then she turned and ran, disappearing into the woods in seconds. I radioed the other rangers and told them what I'd seen, describing the girl and the location. They organized a search, checking the campground and the surrounding trails, but they didn't find anyone. No missing children were reported that night, and no one matching the description had been seen in the park. The head ranger told me it was probably a local kid from one of the houses near the park boundary, someone who'd wandered in and then panicked when I approached. I didn't argue, but I didn't believe it either. The way she'd moved, the way she'd looked at me, it didn't feel like a frightened child. It felt like something else. I saw her again 2 weeks later, this time near one of the picnic areas. I was doing a late patrol, checking the facilities before they closed for the night, when I spotted her standing under a pavilion at the far end of the clearing. Same dress, same tangled hair, same grayish skin. She was standing completely still, facing the woods, her back to me. I called out, but she didn't respond. I started walking toward her, and she turned her head slowly, looking at me over her shoulder. Her expression didn't change, no fear, no surprise, just that flat, empty stare. I stopped walking. She turned back toward the woods and started moving, not running this time, just walking slowly, her bare feet making no sound on the grass. I followed her to the edge of the tree line, and then she stepped into the shadows and vanished. I searched the area with my flashlight, but there was nothing there, no footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been standing there at all. I started asking the other rangers if they'd seen anything unusual, trying to be casual about it, not wanting to sound paranoid. Most of them shrugged it off, but one of the older rangers, a man who'd worked at the park for over 20 years, pulled me aside and told me to be careful. He said the park had a problem with what he called echoes. He didn't explain what he meant, just said that sometimes people saw things that didn't belong, especially near the old logging sites. He said the girl I'd seen had been reported before by other rangers and visitors, always in the same areas, always wearing the same dress. He said no one knew who she was or what she wanted, but that she never hurt anyone, just watched and disappeared. He told me not to follow her into the woods and not to engage with her if I saw her again. I saw her 4 more times that summer, always at dusk, always near the old logging sites. She never spoke, never approached me, just stood and watched until I moved closer, then vanished into the trees. I stopped reporting the sightings after the second time because I could tell the other rangers thought I was making it up or letting the isolation get to me. But I wasn't the only one seeing her. I overheard 2 visitors talking about a little girl they'd seen near the campground, describing the same dress, the same dark eyes. They'd tried to help her, thinking she was lost, but she'd run away before they could reach her. The last time I saw her was the night before I left the park at the end of the season. I was packing up my trailer, loading my gear into my truck, when I heard something outside. I stepped out and saw her standing at the edge of the maintenance yard, about 30 feet away, staring at me. The security light above the yard illuminated her clearly, and for the first time, I could see her face fully. She looked thin, emaciated, her cheeks hollow and her lips cracked. Her dress was stained with something dark, and her bare feet were covered in mud. She took a step forward, and I felt a wave of cold air wash over me, so intense it made my breath fog. I stepped back into the trailer and shut the door, locking it. I looked out the window and saw her still standing there, motionless. Then the security light flickered and went out. When it came back on a few seconds later, she was gone. I finished packing in the dark, loaded the last of my gear by flashlight, and drove out of the park without saying goodbye to anyone. I found out later that the maintenance yard had been built on the site of an old lumber camp, one that had burned down in the early 1900s, killing several workers and their families. No one knew exactly how many people had died or where they were buried, but the state had found bones during construction of the yard and quietly relocated them to a cemetery about 20 miles away. I don't know if the Eid As girl I saw was connected to that fire, but I think about her sometimes, standing at the edge of the woods, watching the people who come and go from a place that used to be her home. The Appalachians are full of places like that, places where the past bleeds through into the present, where the land holds on to what happened and replays it endlessly. The girl I saw wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. She wasn't haunting anyone or seeking revenge. She was just there, repeating whatever moment or memory had trapped her in that place. I don't work in state parks anymore. I moved to a city, took an office job, and tried to forget what I'd seen. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a sound outside my window, a soft footstep or a faint rustling, and I'll remember the way she looked at me that last night, standing in the dark, waiting for something I couldn't give her. There's a trailhead in one of the older state parks in the Appalachians that's marked on every map but barely used. The trail itself is well maintained, a moderate loop that climbs a ridge and then descends back to the parking area, covering about 6 miles round trip. It's not the most scenic trail in the park, and it doesn't lead to any waterfalls or overlooks, which is probably why it's unpopular. But the rangers know it for a different reason. They know it because people go missing on that trail, not frequently, but often enough that it's become an unspoken rule among the staff not to hike it alone and not to hike it after 3 in the afternoon. I worked as a park interpreter for 2 years, leading guided hikes and educational programs for school groups and visitors. The job required me to know the park's trail system intimately, and I spent most of my first season hiking every trail multiple times, learning the terrain, the flora, the wildlife, and the history. The trail I'm talking about, the one on the ridge, was the last one I hiked, not because I was avoiding it, but because every time I mentioned it to the other rangers, they'd find a reason to suggest a different trail. Eventually, I asked the head ranger directly why no one wanted to talk about it. He told me to hike it myself and see. I hiked it on a clear morning in early October, starting just after sunrise when the air was cold and the light was filtering through the trees at sharp angles. The trailhead was empty, no other vehicles in the parking area, which wasn't surprising given how early it was. The trail started gently, winding through a stand of oak and poplar before beginning the climb up the ridge. The forest was dense, the canopy thick enough that even in daylight, the trail felt dim and enclosed. About a mile in, I started noticing markers on the trees, small painted symbols, circles and crosses and lines, faded and barely visible. They didn't match any of the official trailblazes, and they weren't consistent with the boundary markers the Park Service used. I assumed they were remnants from the logging era, old marks that had been painted over but never fully erased. The trail climbed steadily for the next 2 miles, switchbacking up the ridge through thick stands of laurel and rhododendron. The higher I climbed, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the sound of my boots on the trail and my own breathing. I reached the top of the ridge around mid-morning and stopped to rest. The trail leveled out here, following the ridgeline for about half a mile before starting the descent. I sat on a fallen log and drank water, looking around. The forest up here was different, older, the trees larger and more widely spaced. The undergrowth was sparse, just a carpet of dead leaves and moss-covered rocks. It felt isolated in a way that was hard to describe, as if the ridge existed separately from the rest of the park, cut off from the normal flow of life. I started walking again, following the trail along the ridge. About 10 minutes later, I saw something ahead, a structure of some kind, partially hidden by the trees. I walked closer and realized it was a shelter, a small wooden lean-to with a rusted metal roof. It wasn't marked on the map, and it didn't look like any of the official shelters the park maintained. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging in the middle, and the interior was filled with dead leaves and debris. I stepped inside and looked around. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges in the wood that formed patterns, repeating symbols that matched the marks I'd seen on the trees. Someone had carved words into one of the beams, but the letters were so worn I could only make out a few. Stay, turn, follow. I left the shelter and continued down the trail, uneasy now, glancing over my shoulder more often than I normally would. The descent was steep, the trail cutting down the side of the ridge in tight switchbacks. About halfway down, I heard something behind me, a sound like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I stopped and turned around. The trail behind me was empty. I waited, listening, and heard it again, closer this time, the unmistakable sound of boots on dirt. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response. I started walking again, faster now, and the footsteps followed, matching my pace. I stopped. They stopped. I started. They started. I didn't run, but I walked fast, keeping my eyes on the trail ahead, trying to ignore the sounds behind me. The footsteps continued all the way down the ridge, staying just far enough back that I couldn't see who or what was making them. When I reached the bottom of the ridge and the trail flattened out, the sound stopped. I turned around one last time and saw nothing, just the empty trail winding up into the trees. I walked the last mile back to the trailhead without stopping, got in my truck, and drove straight back to the park office. The head ranger was sitting at his desk when I walked in, and he looked up as if he'd been expecting me. I told him what had happened, describing the shelter, the marks, the footsteps. He nodded and said that the shelter had been built decades ago by someone who used to live on the ridge, back before the state bought the land and turned it into a park. He said the person had disappeared, and no one knew what happened to them. He also said that other rangers and hikers had reported hearing footsteps on that trail, always on the descent, always following but never catching up. He said the Park Service had considered closing the trail but decided against it because officially, nothing dangerous had ever happened there. No injuries, no deaths, no documented incidents, just reports of sounds and feelings, things that couldn't be quantified or explained. I hiked that trail one more time later that season because I wanted to see if it would happen again. It did. Same sounds, same pattern, footsteps following me down the ridge but stopping at the bottom. I also found the shelter again and noticed something I'd missed the first time. A pile of stones near the entrance, carefully stacked in a cairn. The stones were covered in the same symbols I'd seen carved into the walls, and in the center of the cairn was a small rusted metal box. I didn't open it. I left the shelter and finished the hike, and I never went back. I've thought about that trail a lot over the years, about the shelter and the footsteps and the marks on the trees. I don't know who built the shelter or what the symbols mean, but I know that something is tied to that ridge, something that repeats a pattern endlessly, following hikers down the trail and then releasing them at the bottom. The head ranger once told me that the Appalachians are full of places where people left marks, trying to claim the land or ward off something they were afraid of. He said the marks don't always work, that sometimes they just trap whatever they were meant to keep out, binding it to a specific place and forcing it to repeat the same actions over and over. That trail is still open. It's still on the maps, and people still hike it, though not many. If you ever find yourself in that park and you're looking at the trail maps, trying to decide where to go, skip the ridge trail. There are better hikes, more scenic, safer. And if you do decide to hike it anyway, start early and finish before 3. Don't stop at the shelter. Don't turn around if you hear footsteps. Just keep walking and don't come back. I worked for a state park in the northern Appalachians for 3 years, handling campground reservations and visitor services during the main season and winterizing facilities during the off months. The park had a reputation for being family-friendly, with well-maintained trails, clean campgrounds, and a small visitor center that offered programs on local wildlife and history. It was the kind of place that attracted repeat visitors, families who came back every summer and requested the same campsites, the same loops, the same picnic areas. But the park also had a section that most visitors avoided, an area in the eastern corner of the property that had been closed to camping for as long as anyone could remember. The closed area covered about 2,000 acres of dense forest and steep terrain, accessible only by an old service road that was gated and locked year-round. The official reason for the closure was environmental protection, something about erosion and endangered species, but the rangers who'd been there for decades knew it was something else. They called it the dead zone, not because anything had died there, but because nothing seemed to live there. No birds, no deer, no small mammals. The trees were stunted and twisted, and the undergrowth was sparse, just patches of sickly ferns and moss. The few times rangers had to go into the area for maintenance or surveys, they reported the same thing. An overwhelming sense of unease, a feeling that they were being watched, and a silence so complete it felt oppressive. I'd heard the stories, but I didn't pay much attention to them until my second year, when the park received a grant to conduct a biodiversity survey of the entire property, including the closed area. I volunteered to help with the survey, thinking it would be interesting to see a part of the park that few people ever visited. The survey team consisted of 4 people: myself, 2 wildlife biologists, and a park ranger who'd worked there for 15 years. We spent a week preparing, gathering equipment, reviewing maps, and planning our routes through the closed area. The ranger, a quiet man who rarely smiled, pulled me aside the day before we were scheduled to start and told me to be careful. He said the area had a way of making people feel disoriented, that compasses didn't always work right, and that we should stick together no matter what. We entered the closed area on a Monday morning in late September, driving the service road as far as the gate, and then hiking in on foot. The road was overgrown, barely visible under layers of leaves and fallen branches, and the forest on either side was dark and tangled. The air felt heavy, humid, even though it hadn't rained in days. We set up base camp about a mile in, near a clearing that the biologists had identified on the map as a good starting point for their surveys. The clearing was small, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by dense trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The ground was soft and damp, covered in a thick layer of moss that muffled our footsteps. The first day was uneventful. The biologists set up their equipment and started collecting samples, recording data on soil composition, plant species, and insect activity. I helped them catalog findings and mark locations on the map. The ranger stayed near the edge of the clearing, keeping watch, his radio clipped to his belt even though we all knew there was no signal this far into the park. By late afternoon, the biologists had finished their initial surveys and were ready to move deeper into the area. We packed up camp and started walking, following a trail that appeared on the older maps but had long since disappeared under the undergrowth. We walked for about an hour, moving slowly through the dense forest, when we came across a structure. It was a cabin, or what was left of one, a collapsed pile of logs and rotted wood surrounded by the remnants of a stone foundation. The biologists were excited, thinking it might be a historic site, and they started taking photos and measurements. I walked around the perimeter, looking for anything that might indicate who had lived there or when it had been built. Near the back of the foundation, I found a metal plate, rusted and partially buried in the dirt. I brushed off the soil and saw an engraving, a date, 1902. Below the date were words, but they were too corroded to read. The ranger told us not to stay long. He said the cabin wasn't on any of the park's records, which meant it predated the park and had probably been forgotten when the land was acquired by the state. He also said he didn't like the way the area felt, that it was too quiet, too still. The biologists agreed to move on, and we left the cabin behind, continuing deeper into the forest. As we walked, I started noticing things that didn't feel right. The trees were all growing at odd angles, leaning away from a central point, as if something had pushed them outward. The ground was uneven, covered in shallow depressions that looked like old graves or collapsed cellars. The moss was thicker here, covering everything, and it had a grayish tint that made it look diseased. We made camp that night near a small stream, the only source of water we'd found in the area. The stream was narrow and sluggish, the water cloudy and smelling faintly of sulfur. The biologists collected samples, noting the unusual color and composition, while the ranger and I set up the tents. By the time we finished, it was dark, the kind of complete darkness you only find in places where the forest is too thick to let in any moonlight. We built a small fire and sat around it, eating cold rations and talking quietly. The ranger kept looking over his shoulder, scanning the tree line with his flashlight. When I asked him what he was looking for, he said he didn't know, just that he felt like something was out there. Around midnight, I heard it. A sound like breathing, slow and rhythmic, coming from somewhere beyond the firelight. I sat up and listened, trying to pinpoint the direction. The sound moved, circling the camp, staying just outside the reach of the fire's glow. The ranger heard it too. He stood up, grabbed his flashlight, and swept the beam across the trees. The breathing stopped. We waited, listening, and then it started again, closer this time, directly behind my tent. The ranger walked over and shined his light into the trees. There was nothing there, just darkness and the twisted shapes of the trunks. The breathing continued throughout the night, circling the camp, stopping when we shined a light toward it, resuming when we looked away. None of us slept. By dawn, we were exhausted and on edge, and the biologists decided to cut the survey short. They said they'd collected enough data and didn't see the point in staying longer. The ranger agreed, and we packed up quickly, eager to leave. As we were loading the gear, I noticed something near the edge of the camp, footprints, human-sized, bare feet pressed into the soft moss. They led away from the camp, into the trees, and then stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. We followed the service road back to the gate, moving faster than we had on the way in, and didn't stop until we were out of the closed area. The ranger locked the gate behind us and said he'd file a report with the park supervisor, recommending that the area remain closed indefinitely. The biologists submitted their findings, noting the lack of wildlife and the unusual soil and water conditions, but they didn't mention the breathing or the footprints. I didn't mention them either, not officially, but I wrote about them in my personal journal, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. I left the park at the end of that season and took a job in a different state, far from the mountains. I've thought about that closed area a lot over the years, about the cabin and the footprints and the sound of breathing that circled our camp all night. I don't know what was out there, but I know it wasn't an animal. Animals don't move like that, don't breathe like that, don't leave footprints that disappear into nothing. The ranger told me later that the area had a history, that people used to live there before the park existed, and that something happened, something bad enough that the state decided to close it off and let the forest reclaim it. He wouldn't say what, and I didn't push him. Some questions don't have answers you want to hear. The closed area is still there, still locked behind that gate, still marked on the maps as off limits. If you ever find yourself in that park, don't ask about it. Don't try to get a key to the gate. There's a reason it's closed, and it's not because of erosion or endangered species. It's because some places are better left alone. I worked maintenance at a state park in the Central Appalachians for 4 years, a job that involved everything from fixing toilets in the campground bathhouses to clearing fallen trees off the trails. It was hard work, but I liked it. I liked being outside, liked working with my hands, liked the rhythm of the seasons and the way the park changed from month to month. The park was large, covering about 25,000 acres, with multiple campgrounds, picnic areas, and a network of trails that ranged from easy nature walks to challenging backcountry routes. My job took me all over the property, into corners and sections that most visitors never saw. One of my regular assignments was maintaining a series of old cabins that the park rented out during the summer. The cabins were located in a remote section of the park, accessible only by a gravel road that wound through several miles of forest. There were 6 cabins total, built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, small one-room structures with stone fireplaces and wooden shutters. They were popular with visitors who wanted a rustic experience, and they booked up months in advance. During the off-season, when the cabins were closed, my job was to winterize them, which meant draining the pipes, boarding up the windows, and checking for damage from weather or animals. The cabins were spread out along a ridge, spaced about a quarter-mile apart, connected by a narrow trail that followed the ridgeline. The farthest cabin, the one at the end of the trail, was the oldest and in the worst condition. The Park Service had talked about tearing it down for years, but they never followed through, partly because it was still structurally sound, and partly because it had historical value. I didn't like working on that cabin. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, a sense of heaviness that settled over me as soon as I stepped inside. The air was always colder than it should have been, even in summer, and the shadows seemed darker, thicker, as if the light couldn't quite reach into the corners. I was winterizing the cabins one November, working my way along the ridge when I reached the last cabin and found the door open. That wasn't unusual in itself. Sometimes the wind would blow the latch loose or an animal would push the door ajar. But when I stepped inside, I saw that the interior had been disturbed. The furniture had been moved, the table and chairs pushed to one side of the room, and the mattress had been pulled off the bed frame and left on the floor. The shutters were still latched from the outside, which meant whoever had been inside had left through the door. I assumed it was kids from one of the nearby towns, teenagers looking for a place to drink or hang out. I cleaned up the mess, reset the furniture, and locked the door when I left. 2 weeks later, I came back to check on the cabins and found the same thing. The last cabin's door was open, the furniture had been moved, and the mattress was on the floor. But this time, there was something else. Writing on the walls. Someone had used charcoal or a burnt stick to scrawl words across the wooden planks, the letters large and uneven. The words didn't make sense, just fragments. Follow, stay, listen, wait. I scrubbed the walls as best I could, but the charcoal had seeped into the wood, leaving faint gray stains. I reported it to the park supervisor, and he said he'd have a ranger patrol the area, but I knew it wouldn't help. The cabins were too remote, too far from the main roads for regular patrols to be effective. I came back a third time in early December, just before the first snow, and found the cabin in the same state. Door open, furniture moved, mattress on the floor. But this time, there was more writing, covering not just the walls, but the floor and the ceiling beams. The same words, repeated over and over. Follow, stay, listen, wait. And in the center of the room, someone had arranged stones in a circle, each stone about the size of a fist, smooth and dark as if they had been pulled from a creek bed. Inside the circle were smaller objects, twigs, bones, scraps of cloth. I didn't touch them. I backed out of the cabin, locked the door, and called the supervisor on my radio. He told me to leave the cabin alone and come back to the office. He'd deal with it. The supervisor drove up to the cabin the next day with 2 rangers, and they cleared out the stones and the objects, scrubbing the walls and floor until most of the writing was gone. They installed a new lock on the door, a heavy-duty padlock that couldn't be picked or forced easily, and boarded up the windows from the inside. The supervisor told me the cabin was officially closed for the season and that I didn't need to check on it again until spring. I was relieved. I didn't want to go back there. But I did go back, one more time, in late March, when the snow had melted and the park was preparing to open for the season. The supervisor sent me up to the cabins to assess what repairs were needed before the rental started. I worked my way along the ridge, checking each cabin, making notes on my clipboard. When I reached the last cabin, I saw that the padlock had been cut. The door was open, the boards on the windows had been pried off, and the interior was in the same state I'd found it before. Furniture moved, mattress on the floor, writing on the walls. But this time, the writing was different. It wasn't just words. There were drawings, crude symbols that looked like stick figures, trees, and shapes I couldn't identify. And in the center of the room, the circle of stones had been rebuilt, larger this time, with more objects inside. Bones, feathers, rusted nails, pieces of glass. I didn't stay long. I took a few photos, locked the door as best I could, and drove straight back to the office. The supervisor looked at the photos and called the state police. They came out the next day with a forensic team, examined the cabin, and collected the objects from the circle. They said the bones were from small animals, nothing human, and the other items were just debris, things someone had collected from the woods. They said it was probably a prank or some kind of ritual, kids experimenting with things they didn't understand. They recommended the park close the cabin permanently and tear it down, which the Park Service agreed to do. The cabin was demolished in late April, the structure taken apart and hauled away, the foundation filled in with dirt and gravel. The park planted grass over the site and removed it from the rental listings. But even after the cabin was gone, people still reported seeing things in that area. Hikers would mention hearing voices coming from the ridge, or seeing lights moving through the trees at night. Rangers on patrol would find the same circle of stones rebuilt in the clearing where the cabin used to be, always with objects in the center, always arranged in the same pattern. I left the park at the end of that season, took a job in a different state, and tried not to think about the cabin or the things I'd seen there. But I still think about it sometimes, about the writing on the walls and the circle of stones and the way the air felt inside that room, cold and heavy and wrong. I don't know who was leaving those objects or why, but I know it wasn't kids playing pranks. Kids don't come back to the same place over and over, rebuilding the same ritual, writing the same words. Whatever was happening in that cabin, it was something older, something tied to the land and the history buried beneath the park. The Appalachians are full of places like that, places where the past doesn't stay buried, where rituals and patterns repeat long after the people who started them are gone. The site where the cabin used to be is still marked on some of the older trail maps, though the Park Service removed it from the official materials. If you ever find yourself hiking that ridge, you might see a clearing that doesn't quite look natural, a patch of ground where the grass grows differently and the trees seem to lean away from the center. Don't stop there. Don't try to find out what used to be there. Some places hold on to what happened and they don't let go. I worked as a backcountry ranger in one of the larger state parks in the southern Appalachians, a job that required me to patrol remote sections of the park, monitor trail conditions, and respond to emergencies in areas that were hours away from the nearest road. The park covered over 50,000 acres, much of it wilderness with no maintained trails, no facilities, and no regular visitors. My patrols took me into sections of the park that most people would never see, areas that appeared on the maps as blank spaces between the marked trails and boundaries. The park had a history of missing persons cases, not a lot, but enough that the rangers talked about it. Every few years, someone would hike into the backcountry and not come out. Sometimes they were found days later, injured or disoriented, explaining that they'd gotten lost or fallen or run out of supplies. Other times, they weren't found at all. Their vehicles would be left at trailheads, their gear still packed, their permits filed with the park office, but the hikers themselves would vanish. The state police would organize searches, bringing in dogs and helicopters and volunteers. But after a few weeks, the searches would be called off, and the cases would go cold. The rangers didn't like to talk about it, not because they were hiding anything, but because there was nothing to say. People disappeared. No one knew why. I was assigned to patrol a section of the park that covered about 8,000 acres of steep, heavily forested terrain in the northwest corner of the property. The area was accessible only by a single trail that started at a remote trailhead and climbed nearly 3,000 feet over the course of 6 miles. There were no shelters, no campsites, no water sources marked on the map. It was designated wilderness, which meant no mechanized equipment, no permanent structures, and minimal human impact. My job was to hike the trail every 2 weeks during the main season, check for hazards, document trail conditions, and look for any signs of illegal activity or environmental damage. I'd been patrolling that section for about a year when I started noticing patterns in the missing persons cases. Most of the people who disappeared had last been seen heading toward the northwest section of the park, the area I was responsible for. They were experienced hikers, people who knew how to navigate, how to read maps, how to survive in the backcountry. They weren't the kind of people who got lost easily. I started keeping my own records, noting the dates and locations of the disappearances, comparing them to my patrol logs. I noticed that the disappearances clustered around certain times of the year, late fall and early spring, when the park was less crowded and the weather was unpredictable. On one of my patrols in October, I found something that made me start asking questions. I was about 4 miles into the trail, climbing through a section of dense laurel and rhododendron, when I saw a backpack lying on the side of the trail. It was a nice pack, expensive, the kind serious hikers use for multi-day trips. The pack was partially covered in leaves, as if it had been there for weeks, but the fabric was still intact, not torn or chewed by animals. I picked it up and looked inside. It was fully loaded: sleeping bag, tent, food, water filter, first aid kit, maps, and a journal. I opened the journal and saw entries dated from earlier that year, describing a solo hiking trip through the park. The last entry was dated September 12th, about 6 weeks before I found the pack. The entry described setting up camp near a creek and planning to hike to the ridge the next day. There was no mention of any problems, no indication that anything was wrong. I radioed the park office and reported the find, giving them the details from the journal and the location where I'd found the pack. They checked their records and confirmed that a hiker matching the description had been reported missing in mid-September. A search had been conducted, but no trace of the hiker had been found. The search had been called off after 2 weeks. I asked if they wanted me to search the area, and they said yes, but to be careful and not to stay out past dark. I spent the rest of the day searching the surrounding area, following the creek downstream, checking the ridges and hollows, looking for any sign of the missing hiker. I didn't find anything. No tent, no campfire, no tracks, nothing. The creek itself was shallow and clear, running over smooth stones, and the banks were soft enough that footprints would have been visible if anyone had walked along them recently. But there were no prints, no disturbed soil, no signs of human activity at all. By late afternoon, I gave up and started hiking back to the trailhead, carrying the pack with me. I brought the pack to the park office, and they logged it as evidence, forwarding it to the state police. I didn't hear anything more about it for several months. Then, in early spring, I was assigned to patrol the same section of trail, and I found another backpack. This one was in a different location, about 2 miles farther up the trail, lying in the middle of the path as if someone had set it down and walked away. It was the same type of pack, same brand, same size, but it belonged to a different person. I knew this because when I opened it, I found a driver's license and a permit, both issued to someone who'd gone missing the previous November. I radioed the office again, and this time, the head ranger drove out to meet me. We searched the area together, spending hours combing the woods around the trail, but we didn't find anything. The head ranger told me that this was the third pack that had been found in that section of the park over the past 5 years, all belonging to people who'd gone missing. He said the state police had investigated, but they'd never found any evidence of foul play. No bodies, no signs of struggle, nothing to suggest what had happened to the hikers. He said the prevailing theory was that the hikers had gotten disoriented, wandered off the trail, and died of exposure, and that animals had scattered their remains. But he also said that theory didn't explain why the packs were always found on the trail, fully loaded, as if the hikers had simply set them down and walked away. I kept patrolling that section of trail for the rest of the season, and I started paying closer attention to the details. I noticed that the area had an unusual feel to it, a heaviness that I hadn't registered before. The light was different, filtered and dim even on clear days, and the sounds were muted, as if the forest itself was absorbing everything. I also noticed that the wildlife avoided the area. I never saw deer, rarely saw birds, and the few times I did see animals, they were moving quickly, as if they were passing through and didn't want to stay. In late June, I was hiking the trail early in the morning when I heard something ahead of me. It sounded like voices, multiple people talking quietly, the words indistinct but the rhythm of conversation clear. I stopped and listened, trying to pinpoint the direction. The voices seemed to be coming from farther up the trail, maybe a quarter mile ahead. I started walking again, moving quietly, and as I got closer, the voices became clearer. They were speaking in English, but the words didn't make sense, just fragments and phrases that repeated, "Follow the line, stay on the path, don't turn back." I rounded a bend in the trail and saw no one. The voices stopped. The trail ahead was empty, the forest silent. I stood there for a long time, listening, waiting for the voices to start again. They didn't. I walked the rest of the trail, checking for footprints or any signs that someone had been there recently, but I found nothing. When I got back to the office, I asked the other rangers if anyone had been hiking that section of trail. They said no, that the trail was closed to the public during the off-season, and that I was the only person authorized to be back there. I finished out the season and requested a transfer to a different section of the park. The head ranger approved it without asking why. I never patrolled that trail again, but I've thought about it a lot over the years. I've thought about the backpacks and the missing hikers and the voices I heard on the trail. I don't know what happens in that section of the park, but I know it's not random. There's a pattern, something that draws people in and keeps them there, something that takes what they leave behind and places it back on the trail as a marker or a warning. The trail is still open. People still hike it, though not many. The Park Service doesn't advertise it, and it's not included in most of the visitor materials. If you're planning a trip to that park and you're looking at the maps trying to decide which trails to hike, avoid the northwest section. There are better trails, safer trails, trails that lead somewhere and bring you back. That trail doesn't bring you back. It takes you somewhere else, somewhere the maps don't show. And it doesn't let you leave. If I worked as a seasonal park ranger for 3 summers in a state park in the northern Appalachians, handling visitor services, campground patrols, and emergency response. The park was well known for its waterfall trails and scenic overlooks, popular with families and day hikers. But it also had a lesser-known feature, a system of caves that ran beneath the eastern section of the park, remnants of old mining operations that had been abandoned in the early 1900s. The caves weren't open to the public, and the entrances were gated and locked, but they were still accessible through a service entrance that the park maintained for research and emergency purposes. I'd heard about the caves from the other rangers, who mentioned them in passing but never went into detail. They said the caves were unstable, that the air quality was poor, and that it was easy to get lost in the tunnels. They also said that the Park Service discouraged any unnecessary access to the caves, and that the only people who went down there were contractors hired to assess the structural integrity or researchers studying the geology. I didn't think much about the caves until my 3rd summer, when I was assigned to accompany a research team into the tunnels to document a survey of the mine shafts. The research team consisted of 2 geologists and a cave specialist, all experienced and well-equipped. We entered the caves through the service entrance, a rusted metal door built into the side of a hill about 2 miles from the main campground. The door opened onto a narrow concrete stairway that descended steeply into the earth, the walls damp and covered in a slick layer of moss. We descended about 50 feet before the stairway ended, and the tunnel system began. The tunnels were larger than I'd expected, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, with wooden beams reinforcing the walls and ceiling. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and rust. The researchers turned on their headlamps and started moving deeper into the system, following a map that showed the main shafts and the connecting passages. My job was to stay with the group, help carry equipment, and make sure everyone stayed safe. The Park Service had given me a radio, but I'd been warned that it probably wouldn't work once we were more than a few hundred feet into the tunnels. We walked for about 20 minutes, descending gradually, passing through several intersections where smaller tunnels branched off from the main shaft. The researchers stopped periodically to take measurements, photograph the walls, and collect samples of the rock and soil. They talked quietly among themselves, discussing the age of the tunnels and the methods that had been used to excavate them. I stayed near the back of the group, keeping an eye on the passage behind us, making sure we didn't get separated. About half a mile into the system, we reached a large chamber, a roughly circular space about 30 feet across with a high ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. The researchers were excited, saying it was likely a central hub where the miners had sorted ore or stored equipment. They set up their gear and started documenting the chamber, taking photos and making notes. I walked around the perimeter, shining my flashlight along the walls, and noticed something carved into the stone near the floor. Names, dozens of them, scratched into the rock in rough, uneven letters. I called the researchers over, and they examined the carvings, noting that the names were likely those of the miners who had worked there. Some of the names had dates next to them, ranging from 1898 to 1903. One of the geologists pointed out that several of the names were followed by a symbol, a simple cross, which she said probably indicated that those miners had died in the tunnels. She counted the crosses and said there were at least 15, which suggested that the mine had been dangerous even by the standards of the time. I asked if there were any records of what had happened, and she said the Park Service had a few old documents, but most of the history had been lost when the mine was abandoned. We spent about an hour in the chamber, and then the researchers decided to explore one of the side tunnels that branched off from the main shaft. The tunnel was narrower and lower than the others, and we had to crouch to move through it. The air was colder here, and the walls were slick with moisture. About 100 feet into the tunnel, the researchers stopped. One of them pointed to the floor and said there were tracks, footprints in the mud, leading deeper into the passage. The prints were fresh, no more than a few days old, and they were bare feet, human-sized, moving in a straight line deeper into the tunnel. The cave specialist said it was impossible. The service entrance was locked, and there was no other way into the tunnels. He also said the air quality in this part of the system was too poor to support human life for more than a few minutes without proper equipment. But the prints were there, clear and undeniable. The researchers decided to follow them, moving slowly and carefully, checking the air quality with a handheld monitor as we went. The prints continued for about 200 feet, then stopped abruptly at a small alcove in the tunnel wall. The alcove was about 3 feet deep, carved into the rock, and inside were objects, bones, small animal bones, arranged in a circle. In the center of the circle was a rusted metal box, similar to the ones I'd seen in the cabin on the ridge. The researchers examined the box but didn't open it. They said it was probably left by someone exploring the tunnels illegally, though they couldn't explain how that person had gotten in or why they'd gone so far into the system. They took photos and then decided to turn back, saying the air quality was getting worse and it wasn't safe to go any deeper. We retraced our steps, moving back through the narrow tunnel and into the main shaft. As we walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling as if something was following us, just out of sight in the darkness behind. We reached the chamber again and stopped to rest. The researchers were reviewing their notes and discussing what they had found when I heard something. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of dripping water and our own breathing, but it was there. A voice, a low murmur coming from one of the other tunnels that branched off from the chamber. The researchers heard it too. They stopped talking and listened. The voice continued, speaking in a rhythm that sounded like a chant or a recitation, the words indistinct but the tone clear. The cave specialist said it was probably an echo, sound bouncing off the walls from somewhere else in the system, but none of us believed that. Echoes don't sound like voices. They don't have rhythm or inflection. We left the chamber quickly, not discussing it, just moving as fast as we could back toward the entrance. The voice followed us, staying just far enough behind that we couldn't pinpoint its location, but close enough that we could hear it clearly. It didn't stop until we reached the stairway and started climbing back to the surface. When we emerged from the service entrance, back into the daylight, none of us said anything for a long time. We loaded the equipment into the truck and drove back to the park office in silence. The researchers filed their report, noting the structural condition of the tunnels and the historical carvings they had found, but they didn't mention the footprints or the voice or the objects in the alcove. I didn't mention them either, not officially, but I wrote about them in my notes, and I asked the head ranger if there were any records of people accessing the caves without authorization. He said there weren't, that the service entrance was the only way in and it was kept locked at all times. He also said that several rangers over the years had reported hearing sounds coming from the tunnels, sounds that didn't match anything that should be down there. He said the Park Service had considered sealing the entrance permanently, but they'd never followed through. I didn't go back into the caves. I finished out that summer and decided not to return for another season. I've thought about what we found down there, about the footprints and the voice and the objects arranged in that alcove. I don't know what it means, but I know it wasn't random. Someone, or something, is moving through those tunnels, repeating patterns that were started over 100 years ago by people who are long dead. The Appalachians are full of places like that, places where the past is still active, where the work and rituals of the people who came before continue even after they're gone. The caves are still there, still locked behind that rusted metal door, still mapped and monitored by the Park Service. If you ever find yourself in that park, near that section of the property, don't ask about the caves. Don't try to get access. There's nothing down there worth seeing, nothing that needs to be disturbed. Some places are better left sealed.